Good morning,
Whoa,
afternoon.
whipping the knife out.
I'm going to tell you a story about how and when I whip my knife out, and I do factually mean my pocket knife. But yeah, I was super second nature. I didn't even think about that. So sorry about that, Jeffrey. If you weren't awake before, Jeffrey's awake now. As I
Coffee when you just have
flip-
a knife flip
flip
open
my
at you.
flip my pocket knife out and
At least I did mine
super
quietly.
speed. I don't even know where I was. Good morning, afternoon, wherever, however you are. This is the I Speak Jeep podcast, where apparently we're about to shank some people. Not really, but I was opening up. It is a happy St. Paddy's Day to you folks. And the leprechaun visited my household and brought green rock candy suckers. So I thought I would share with them on air, with you guys.
And we have to guess as a community how long it's going to take Jeff. Oh, there it is.
Yeah.
No knife needed.
No knife needed. No knife needed. Rip that cover off it, buddy.
Surprised he wasn't gnawing on it.
Yeah. And you gentlemen are whom?
I am Jeff, the producer.
The Italian Stallion.
That can rip open a rock candy by bare hands.
That's why he's got multiple children. All right.
Yes.
And you are... That wrapper on there was like impenetrable, but don't worry, Jeff's like, I will break it.
Anyways.
Maybe how a kid or two happened.
I don't even know
Scott doesn't even know
where to go from there. The confused mad scientist.
Oh, my gracious.
Slightly appalled. Amazed.
Also, if you thought we were off to a banging start, I promise you, we're going to talk about vehicular, technical Jeep stuff today. But it is also a follow-up from
Pie Day.
Pie Day last Friday, and we have cream pie for you, Scott.
Uh-huh.
And
Because we're children.
This was all conceptualized on Pie Day, and we're like, we're not going to be able to do an episode because we know what kind of pie we have to buy.
yep,
Yeah. I
we were
understand.
gonna only do cream pies. Fortunately, I forgot because I would have been 10 times worse. But Jeffrey did make sure to have a pie for us. Now, it's not thawed, folks who are listening at home. So we have it dished up, and maybe by the time that we're doing our weekend updates at the very end of the
We
program,
won't break our teeth at that point.
we won't break our teeth on the ice cube pie for everybody's entertainment there.
So I'm going to jump to the comments because there's a ton of them right now. Nate, good morning. He got first.
Good job, Nate.
Joe O'Brien, good morning. Giaga Jeepers, good morning. Nate again with Mudhorn Gladiator, good morning.
Mm-hmm.
Billy Joel Lyman is saying good morning.
Mm-hmm.
Daddy Jeep says morning. Family is away off road. If I remember from last week, that's also Nate. And then we got Bill McWilliams, top of the morning.
Top
to
of
you.
the morning to you. That was bad. That wasn't it. It was so better in my head.
I knew you were going to do Irish, but I thought you would do better.
I
I'm
thought I was going to do
disappointed.
better too.
You're going to have to do it again
Oh.
later. And then Chip Fury's in there saying good morning, SFJ.
Good morning. Good morning to everybody. I'm going to have a hard time not just crunching on this and the microphone to people.
So just pull your mic away a little bit as you do it.
I was like, crunch on it.
Yeah,
I
or
was just
kinda lean over.
disappointed that, and I understand you had pie to get and you had rock candy to get, but no one else is in green.
Honestly, I forgot to wear green today.
You know what?
I meant to.
I saw your OD green motif, and I appreciated it when I first saw you this morning, but we were so focused on getting the American Hustle. And
The
doing
hustle of the American
the hustle of the
That's right.
of the American Hustle morning opportunities there. So yeah, I saw your green. I own very little green. I have a good sexy flannel that I should have worn.
Yeah.
I wear it pretty often. It's green and blue. I forgot.
I actually had
about
to steal this hoodie from my wife because
it. Well, that makes
I
sense.
don't have a green non-ruined hoodie.
Non-ruined.
But
That's fair.
I did bring extras, so she doesn't have to be dismayed. That
Oh,
this
you're not
is-
going to ruin this
I'm
one
not
as
going to
well.
ruin it. As soon as I get off air, changing.
You're changing.
Yeah.
I understand that.
Makes sense.
I understand that all too well. Anywho, we are supposed to be finishing up our conversation about suspension, the Suspension Chronicles. And
I had in the producer notes that we're not allowed to talk about shocks because that will be a separate conversation.
that is
Just
correct.
warning you now.
Yes.
That is
we
correct.
want to talk about shocks.
We are
There's
going to
so much
do
to talk about shocks. We have to not
an
talk
entire separate episode, but not right away.
Yeah.
Right? We're gonna put that off to the future.
So is it kind of like the first rule?
The first rule of suspension
If
is
you haven't seen the YouTube, go check out the YouTube video.
Yeah.
the YouTubes. That was a fun one.
Yeah. I
I always like when we get to do it together.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh, there's a actual person that a lot of people believe to be a myth
Mm-hmm.
in this video.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And he was all too excited.
He was very
kind of
excited to
he
do
kind of
this video.
smiled and giggled through
it
the
kind of
the,
threw
the
me
shot.
off.
I know. But you know what? We coordinated specifically just so that you and he could all be present in it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really fun. So check out that YouTube video. We're also looking for YouTube content. Obviously, we're at no shortage of me running my yapper, but what kind of content do people want to see and hear is always of value. You can reach out to us on our text only 440-855-2100 and give us some ideas that you might like to see done in the future. Maybe, just maybe, we'll use one of your ideas. All right, suspension. We left off. We chronicled all the old stuff.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite, leaf spring rear, 4-link coil front.
Mm-hmm.
And we had moved on to the future. We had talked briefly about control arms.
Mm-hmm.
We're not addressing any steering geometry in this particular
Right.
go around. This
We-
is just
I think where we're at, we're going to need to talk about coils and coil rates.
mm-hmm.
We're going to need to talk about airbags,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we need to talk more about control arms. Specifically, you mentioned 4-link, but I don't think we really broke down control arms at all.
Coolio and the
Mhm.
gang,
And that versus long arms and all of that.
right?
I know you touched base on like the short / mid arm conversation
Right.
of today's Jeeps.
Right. Well, I think that there is value in picking up on coils because I'm particularly passionate about coils.
Mm-hmm.
So as we had talked about, roughly leaf spring steel and the many leaves in our vintage vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
And then as manufacturing tolerances increased, through history, as we move, into more recent history, we could do the same work, maybe even better with less leaf springs,
Yes.
right? So coils aren't that far off either. We actually have coils in,
Except for the aftermarket went the other way,
what do you mean?
where you need more with the aftermarket with coils.
100%. But I guess what I was going to say is like we had coils in old school vehicles, right? Cars had
Yes.
some coils. We see coils in the car and the truck industry long before we see it in Jeeps,
Yes.
right? And those coils were typically these big, thick, honking.
Well, you had basically two different main styles I can think of in OE cars. You had basically your straight spring, and you had your taper straight, then taper spring,
Right.
kind of more roundy on the ends. And as Jeeps first broke into the coil game, they went with pretty much standard straight springs.
Right. And for this type of spring steel is manufactured in such a way where it is called a linear spring. So
You kind of get what you're going to get at any point in the spring,
the
top
rate
to bottom.
the rate is intended to be equilateral. So when they talk about a compression ratio, so if it's I'm going to use the term a 200-pound spring, that means that roughly it takes 200 pounds of pressure or force to compress that spring roughly an inch, right? So so that linear rate is going to, whether it's at the top and you're just the top 4 inches, that compression is 200 pounds, the bottom, but basically it's equilateral from top to bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And that was good all the way up until about 2015, as far as I was concerned.
So the back of the JK, they went to the more into the tapered springs on the OE springs, and they actually even made almost like a beehive looking spring. And I think what that was trying to do was to get a more not so much a progressive rate, but more of a cushy rate, because now you're not going to have coil bind, because the coil is literally not got anything above it, because it transitions as it goes up. And then as it went up to the frame actually went back the other direction. So you literally looks like a beehive. Where most of our aftermarket springs in that era got rid of that style and went to a more standard straight spring, except for...
Oh, rock crawler? Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, that's one of them. JKS also did it.
Oh, yeah. Well, everybody went to like multi-rate springs.
Multi-rate springs. Obviously, Rockcrawler needed all the rates.
Right. I was going to say, right now, I think most trendy is going to be RK, Metal Cloak, and then JKS. JKS was running a dual rate for the longest time.
So what,
RK and MC run triple rates.
I was just going to say, so what
Because if 2 rates are good, then 3 are better.
what is the innate benefits or perceived benefits of double and triple rate springs versus a linear?
Well, and so this was an interesting, conversation at one period of time, because there was actually a number of performance manufacturers who kind of refused to get onto the bus of running a dual rate or a triple rate.
Yeah.
Because they felt like it was a little gimmicky. Because the perceived, or the primary argument, is that you have a single spring steel, right? So we're not talking about coilovers where you have a hard break of 2 separate coils, right? But you have maybe a 6 inches of a more softer spring rate, and those are a more tightly wound coil spring, and then you have the load carrying spring, which could be 8, 10, 12 inches, and that's going to be a more stiff, and so that's intended a stiff or a heavier rated spring, and that is intended to carry the weight or the load of the vehicle, whereas that smaller spring is actually meant to retain the spring in its position as you articulate. So as you stretch the legs of your vehicle and you droop that suspension, you're not supposed to lose the coil. Additionally, as you're doing kind of the argument, Terraflex was the one who really tried making this argument. They actually shot a couple slow-mo high-speed videos and whatnot, was that this softer rate was meant to do more vibratory dampening at speed. And so that softer spring was actually working more vigorously than the primary load coil. And then as you would Baja, it would all stretch out, but it would remain seated. Because obviously, certainly Scott and I remember a lot, there was a time, certainly in the 90s and early 2000s, where a Jeep would get totally stretched out. It would get all limbered up, and then all of a sudden, the coil exited stage
and
left.
You got to do trust exercises with your friend. As he put his hands inappropriately in the suspension, putting the spring back in as you backed up or went forward, whatever it
was.
To get back on the suspension. And for a while there, like my XJ, you just bolted the coil to the axle, and at some point it just came unseated and the spring wasn't doing anything. The axle, well, that's why I had to make it the heaviest Dana 30 as well, is because it needed the weight of the axle to keep the tire on the ground.
Right.
And
well, and that was the thing with specifically, I think it started in our XJs, you actually had a coil retainer clip on a tab that was just a little 10 mil bolt or so. I don't even recall exactly. And it was just a little tab that it just kept the pigtail of the spring seated, and you needed to have sufficient jounce or jounce extension from the top. So your actual bump stop needed to be sufficiently long enough so that as the coil unseated, it still stayed connected to the Jeep in some way. So while it was no longer sitting in its seat perfectly, so the top pigtail was kind of free floating 6-8 inches, it was still at least captured by the fact that the bump stop was in there kind of getting all bendy wonky. And so that as the suspension kind of compressed and came back down, inevitably the coil pigtail would kind of go back to its home.
Yeah.
Now, JK owners hated this because they were absolutely convinced on the forums and on the social pages and by the science-based manufacturers that your pigtails had to stay perfectly oriented exactly where they're supposed to. And quite frankly, you thought JK people were bad. JLs are even worse. Now we have keyed isolators, and the engineers actually did this.
Yes.
And now we have, through a number of these other manufacturers, we have these new anti-wrap, anti-flex keyed coil spring correction plates to keep the pigtail exactly where and how it's supposed to be.
Yep.
Which is interesting because there is merit or value in that conversation, because what the manufacturer is doing is saying, if I can guarantee the orientation of the pigtail, then I can guarantee how that spring is going to work.
Right.
Correct.
Because the problem is, and this was the performance manufacturers who were slow to move to multi-rate springs, they said, I want to stay on a linear spring or a single rate because I can guarantee I can predict how that's going to work. Whereas if I've got a small wrap on a dual rate that's at 140 pounds, and then I have this ambiguous transition between 140, and then I have my load carrying spring of 220 pounds, I can't actually predict how that spring is going to work under your Jeep in a consistent fashion, the majority of the time. Sometimes it's going to behave this way, and sometimes it's going to behave that way. But the market didn't care. People thought dual rates were cool. And again, if dual rates are cool, then triple rates are cooler. And manufacturers responded with their marketing and with their their approach to say, hey, you want dual rate, we give you dual. If you want triple, we'll give you triple. And eventually some of these holdouts who had just a single rate spring started offering both as well.
Yep.
Now, JKS only offers dual rate. Iron Rock offers linear and dual rates. I think RK only offers their multi-rate springs.
Yep.
And there is an argument to be made in the sense that some manufacturing technological improvements have come about in order to allow these manufacturers to give more consistent behaviors to these springs.
Yeah.
So there is some benefit, but in the earliest years, these springs behaved, a little bit awkwardly, or you might eventually get some spring sag because that 140 over here sagged out way sooner than the left side. Certainly on the JKs, there was a whole conversation about JK lean where it would lean to the gas tank.
Yep.
Well, arguably that had as much to do with just the spring softening on the passenger side, kind of at a different rate than the driver's side. But, the internet didn't want to hear that. People wanted to just believe their manufacturers were great, and it was the gas tank's problem. So, anywho.
Well, and then you get into even more modern with like the 4xEs, and now your spring rates are changing.
Yeah, and so, for folks who, might not exactly be familiar, and so I want to break it down. Typically speaking, your two-door springs are lighter by 20 to 40 pounds than your four-door springs. It's
taken the hard top versus soft top. Back in the day,
Mm-hmm.
when you were standing at your 4x4 shop and you're ordering a lift kit, one of the questions they would ask you are you a hard top Jeep or a soft top Jeep? And you had a decision to make.
Yep.
And if you were a hard top Jeep in the winter and you soft topped in the summer, you might have more lift out of it than you expected, which is something else I think we need to like two seconds and talk about. Back in the day, it was a Wild West. You'd get a 3-inch spring, you put it in the Jeep, you might get 5 inches of lift
100%.
out of it. And you kind of had to pivot
Mm-hmm.
after you lifted the Jeep to decide then, well, now do I need to modify my steering, my drive shafts, all that other kind of stuff. And like Neil was saying, the JK kind of like swept the industry and changed that because people were like, no, if I'm getting a 2-inch lift, I want it to be exactly 2 inches. If I want a 3-inch lift, I want it to be 3 inches. We've even had people down to the 1/2 inch. They want it exactly as they can be.
Yes, but I will say that even today's standards, we still run into that. And if you don't know the spring rates and the way the
Yes.
springs are designed, you may end up getting a 3-inch lift and getting 5 inches of it on your diesel Gladiator going, what happened?
It is true, but it's less than it used to be. Like literally before it was like, I don't know, every Jeep's different. We have to see. Where now we have more consistency across the industry.
I think it's fascinating. I'm going to just kind of pick on a phrase you just said. We used to say that
Yep.
with so much regularity. Like every Jeep's different. We get a little bit of a different result. And you're right. The JK forced consistency into an industry
Yep.
that otherwise was very one-off before that.
100%.
And so lift kits and specifically coil springs largely experienced much of that just in the last 10 years, honest to Pete.
Yep.
And as Jeffrey brought up, we literally encountered this discrepancy in coil rates and weights and kind of experiential expectations by a 3.5 inch spring factually providing over 5 inches of lift
Yeah.
on a 2023, 2024, or whatever it was, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, that's only because it was not the norm. It was different than their normal recipe. If it would have been a gasser, they would have had probably better
Consistency and predictability.
But the fact that it was a diesel, they got their jumps to conclusions mad out.
Yes.
And they're like, oh no, it needs to be this extra.
Yes.
Well, didn't really.
Right. And I think
Well,
it's value.
One of the kits we purchased wasn't for diesel. Was it the one that we ended up with the right length out of?
Yes.
So that was
That was the one that I predicted. Honestly, I bought a 5-inch spring and I expected to get a net 3.5.
on the diesel.
And we did net 3.5.
Yep.
We bought a 3.5-inch diesel spring and
Got
we netted 5.
Yep.
And that was me and these manufacturers. There were 2 different manufacturers comparing the weights and the compression ratios of these springs themselves,
Yep. Doing the
And-
science of it.
trying to do the science of it.
Yeah.
And and that's, these manufacturers are looking for predictability and consistency, because we do have some people, as you mentioned, wanting to go out and measure a fixed point on their frame rail to the ground and then put the spring in, and they want to see that advertised number.
Yep.
And realistically, that was just not something that anybody cared to do
In the,
over 15 years ago.
yeah,
really,
in the
very
late
few
90s, early 2000s, that wasn't a thing.
people. I would agree.
I literally remember telling people, because at that time I had a 93 black Sport XJ, and Amy, my wife, had a black Sport 90 XJ.
Mhm.
They're identical, and the lift kit, we lifted 2 different brands, and it was totally different
Mm-hmm.
result. And otherwise, the Jeeps were identical.
Sure.
So now we can pretty much tell you what to expect, as long as you have a very standard equipped Jeep. If you get a 4xe or a diesel, there is a little bit of the Wild
There's some
West.
nuance in there. And I was going to say, the point I was going to make before is that oftentimes people think that somehow the springs themselves, that there's magic, or they vary wildly. And they don't. The difference really is, again, in that pressure per square inch of compression, right? So it could be 180 pounds to compress 1 inch. It could be 200 pounds to compress 1 inch. It could be 220 pounds. Very rarely do we go up over the 240, 250 mark.
Daddy Jeep said we didn't know how to use tape measures back then.
Oh, I'm gonna say we did, because I remember he'd call up your buddy and be like, "Dude, I actually got 5 inches of lift out of it, so now I got to get bigger tires, man."
I was going to say, that's what we wanted.
And you'd see people selling off like their 33s that they hadn't properly bought before they lifted their Jeep, and now they're looking for 35s.
Oh, yeah.
Or the Vice happened, they got 35s, and they're like, "Oh, it's not that tall."
I
I'm
didn't get
rubbing."
enough lift.
I remember people asking to swap tires all the time back then.
Constantly, man.
Scott Bennett's on, so good morning, Scott.
Good morning.
That I think is to your credit about the predictability is now somebody comes in looking for a lift. What size tires you want to run, we know exactly what lift to put them in.
Yep.
Right.
How are you going to use your vehicle? We know exactly what lift to put them in based on how they're going to use it, what size tires they want. We're able to predict these things.
Well, that's certainly how we have taken the cards that we've been dealt by the industry and been able to try and translate it to our customer base to kind of ensure that they are happy, because the expectation out of the Jeep also changed.
Yes.
The way that we're using our Jeeps, we're using them with more versatility, more utilitarian nature than ever before, in the sense of not just utilitarian in the fact that we used to go beat around in the woods and then haul a small trailer and haul some firewood or whatever, but now you're throwing the whole family in there and you're going on vacation too.
Yeah.
You're going to the movies on Saturday night in the Jeep.
You're taking a camper with you now.
Right.
With the JT, you're putting a actual size trailer behind it with a vehicle on it sometimes, so you're expecting more out of the experience of your Jeep, where before I remember, you don't put a big trailer behind
Right.
a Wrangler,
Which is where the that level of inconsistency out of the suspension is in part, and we can go back even decades further, where it's a Jeep, it's supposed to handle like that.
Yep.
You don't like it, go, buy yourself a Cadillac to drive on Sunday,
Yep.
and now folks are instead getting into their JK, their JL, their JT, and driving it on Sunday to grandma's house and to work on Monday and beating on it Friday night.
I'll be honest, when I first came in as a customer looking at lift kits, I think you said it best on the phone, on our phone consult. It was a late night, way after hours. You had called me back, and we were going through.
I don't remember that, Jeffrey, but that sounds likely.
It was probably like an hour and a half phone call.
Sounds normal.
We got off the phone. My wife's like, "Man, that guy could talk." I'm like, "Yeah, he can."
Oh, shit. Yikes.
So, anyways, but you said it best. Where when you install the lift kit at the shop, we go one step further and we tune the suspension.
Mm-hmm.
Tuning the suspension is something that you don't think about as a consumer.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And that is where the market has taken us. Back in the day, we didn't do that because it just was not as necessary as it more so is now.
Or available at that time. You kind of got what you got,
Oh, that's 100% true.
and you just basically had to deal with it. That's why the pivot thing works so much, because you just had to be like, okay, we're going to adapt and figure this out so that we can now drive our vehicle again. Where now it's almost routine, like a routine surgery almost, where you go in, you know what's going to happen. You kind of have the expectation of what the end result's going to be. You know how the longevity is going to be. Where back in the day, you had no idea. Next year, it could be sagged out 3 inches.
Well, and that is in part, I was going to share with folks that there's only a handful of spring steel manufacturers who are capable of making these coil springs. And interestingly enough, one of the leading manufacturers is out west. Their manufacturer's name is Eibach. I ran those on a number of coil over suspension systems that we've put together over the years. And I will talk about coilovers just briefly before we transition on to, other parts of the suspension. But a large swath of aftermarket coil springs, there's one manufacturer who's in like Missouri, Kansas area, and then there's one manufacturer who's up in Canada. Both kind of center mass. Realistically speaking, and I'm going to go out on a limb here and say this with a relative authority, kind of regardless of who you're buying, whose lift kit you've purchased and installed on your vehicle, if you have coil springs on it and they're not Eibach, they basically came from those two factories.
Terrible.
That's just what it is. You either have Canadian springs or you have these Kansas, Missouri-esque springs. And that's just what it is, right? And we've been doing this for years and years and years. They're great manufacturers. We've got great partnership across the border with Canada to provide those. There's North American Steel. A lot of those manufacturers still represent themselves as made in the USA, or this Kansas group, and they don't do as many as my understanding at this point. Than once they once did. Most of them are actually coming from this Canadian manufacturer. And that's just kind of on a good authority to say that. So it's, these folks who claim they have this, that, and the third experience. That's if you're getting USA or North American. That, we can get import spring steel all day long as well. And those lift kits coming from across the pond to the west, there are springs doing that too. That's fine.
Real quick in the comments, I got Keith and Fred both saying good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. So those brands have kind of come up, so has these manufacturers' expectation. I think it's valuable to say, and I guess I'm going to go ahead and say it, but like until one of these manufacturers proves me otherwise, and I don't care who it is, whether it be Metal Cloak or Rockcrawler or Clayton or Rough Country, whoever, none of them actually have a spring steel forge, if you will, in their back room. That's just not a thing.
Something else that kind of changed at the same time as the springs was bushing technology. Back in the day, you got polyurethane bushings, and you got, I'd say 3 years maybe of good life out of them before they were ragged out and sloppy as all get out. And then we tried to do some Heim-esque stuff, but it was real rude at that time.
100%.
And likewise, you didn't get very good life out of it. And at some point, somebody was like, hey, how about we use the stock Cleveite style rubber bushings that the OEs use?
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say since then, we've really right up the chart on reliability, rideability.
Isn't that funny how many of us who were around back then, or even anything in the automotive industry, that urethane that we were buying in the 80s and 90s.
It's terrible.
And the problem is we just didn't know what we didn't know, because we were still oil undercoating vehicles and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And any type of
grease and everything. And
yes, and we wanted greasable and serviceable.
Well, I'm guilty. I remember going across a field in my classic car with urethane bushings in the control arms, and it was
Oh, 100%.
I sprayed every type of penetrating / oil, whatever it was, because I just wanted them to shut up.
Oh my God, we all did.
Ate away at the rubber. Yep.
We all did,
Yep.
right? We all did, and that was such
Absolutely.
a funny thing, because we all bought in this idea that
Get
somehow
the WD-40 out.
these were better.
Yes.
And
less deflection.
Yes, less deflection, and they were a more robust product, and all they, like you said, all they did was break down fast. When we went to rod ends. Now the thing is, rod end technology has been around forever in the agricultural industry and in the industrial environment. And I got to be honest with you folks, those two products were very different from each other. The industrial rod ends were beefy and robust and kind of you couldn't blow them apart, but you paid all the money for them.
Yep.
And then you had tractor rod ends, which has been used for clutch linkages and your center link and your implements.
And the tolerance were two widely things. Even though they looked the same, the tractor, you can kind of, it can have a ½ inch of slop, and you
100%.
can still get it done.
That implement's just going to drag around and flop around behind the tractor regardless.
Right. Where the industrial stuff was actually the minutia of that. But that's why the price was so high.
Correct.
And I don't know about anybody else. When I was building a Jeep back in the day, I didn't have any money, so I wanted to make it as cheap as possible.
Right.
So
right.
More often than not, tractor stuff got used, but then your experience showed.
Right. It was depreciated because of you get what you pay for. So as manufacturers came into the market offering better rod end technology for your control arms, they really kind of established a stronghold. Now, there was a big conversation specifically, I know because my experience with the great Commonwealth state, if you will, of Pennsylvania, and whether or not rod ends were legal to be on the road.
And they are, but some mechanics didn't believe they were.
20 years ago, not enough people knew.
Yeah.
Right? Did not know whether or not they were legal. And here I am running with this prototype Skyjacker kit, which has rod ends
Yep.
that fall somewhere in the middle of this industrial and agricultural. They're not cheap. They are road-worthy, engineered rod ends. And you've got these, these mechanics who had not, all they know is that was used on a 3-link on a tractor.
Right.
You can't have that on the road. And it's like, well, but
or
I can.
they had an experience with somebody using a tractor joint, and now it's guilty by association.
100%.
Because it looks like that, it has to be like that. And I think personally, who changed the industry on that was Curry, because they came out with the Johnny joint. It was like the buzzword of the 2000s.
Yes.
And it was used then in everything. And I would say most joints today are designed off of that design.
I would agree. The only other one that I would add to the conversation is Rockcrawler with their initial rod end kits. And I feel like it's my grandma's potato salad, which I've talked about before, and she spit in it, which is what made it taste so good. But RK literally had some magic in their rod ends in their kits 15 years ago.
Yep.
So if you were a person who jumped into the market in the early mid 2000s, so you jumped in 06 through 10, you legitimately got a rod end base kit from RK, from Rockcrawler, that was bomb proof. I mean, just absolutely bomb proof. And I wish that was still their reputation and their manufacturing. But I know too many customers who were running those products, and they were just some of the best suspension. And so 10, 11, 12 years later, those control arms and the rod ends themselves are still taking a beating and have not been rebuilt. Whereas we have a number of customers who bought their control arms in the last 3 to 5 years and have rebuilt it twice already or got rid of the suspension entirely.
Well, and the other nice thing, though, is we have more options. Because now one of the conversations is, hey, how are you going to use your Jeep?
Yeah.
And if you're going to use it as a slinky every weekend, well, we're going to go with a more flex joint style.
And we're typically going to go with that Curry-inspired,
yes,
Johnny joint-inspired product.
we're also going to educate you and be like, hey, at some point in your ownership, you will rebuild these.
Correct.
Where if you're like, hey, I'm going to go like once a month off-road, and I want to, it's my daily driver, I'm beating it up the
I've got
highway.
a big commute.
Then we're going to put you in rubber
And that
bushing
rubber
style.
Clevite design is just works.
Yes.
It really does. And, as long as it's an appropriate rubber compound and you're not oil undercoating the vehicle, those rubber Clevites are going to last unless you're using it as a slinky with regularity.
Yes.
And that's, just kind of the truth of the matter. And it was developed under, harsh conditions to diminish NVH, noise, vibration, harshness.
I'm going to jump in on this, though, because, yes, they'll last unless you're using it as a slinky. Or if you don't properly set up your suspension and you're leaving those Clevite bushings
Bound.
clamped and bound.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because now you're just cutting the life in half.
Yeah,
if-
you're
if not
literally
worse.
ripping
That's that
them in
fine
half.
tuning. That's that tuning portion
Yeah.
you mentioned.
That's part
Yeah.
of it, yeah.
Yeah. Or if they're binding constantly. Right. And that's the thing, is that if they have been reoriented to work appropriately with the lift,
Yes.
Yeah.
then they flat out work. If not, then you've added layers to the problem.
And it goes, kind of without saying, but I'll say it anyway. The longer and flatter your arms are, the better ride you're going to have and the better experience you're going to have with your Jeep. And that goes with track bars, with control arms, that kind of stuff.
So long arm the world?
Maybe.
Long arm the world. So, we cover the kind of the myriad of things as far as control arm technology and flex joints or bushing technology. I will mention there's a couple fringe manufacturers. I did bring up Eibach with the springs. There is a manufacturer called QA1 who is making their own rod ends. There are a number of suspension manufacturers where I call them out on their springs. I will kind of give them grace on their rod ends, where there are a number of these folks who have full machine shops who are tooling out their own proprietary flex joints. And so, a control arm itself is arguably just a piece of round stock, or if you're Clayton, square stock steel. There's not a lot of magic there.
Sometimes
down
they
to-
have a magic bend in them.
Sometimes they have a magic bend, which is where my bias with Iron Rock Off Road. They put so much R&D into their magic bends, or JKS has a couple track bars that have magic bends in them that they just outshine the competition. When you touch lots of products,
Yeah.
we can just see the difference, you know. But otherwise, the product, the stock itself, even our import control arms, honestly aren't bad. That arm is rarely going to itself break.
Yeah, it's the bushings is honestly
It's
where
the bushings, it's the threaded inserts,
Yep.
it's the jam nut technology or the clamping, however you're affixing that control arm.
We've literally seen it where the pockets are ripped off, but the arms are still fine.
Correct.
Yes.
So, so understand that what sets these manufacturers apart is that bushing and that jam or clamping technology that kind of differentiates the arms.
And the threads.
Right.
Yeah, because lots of imports or some imports use a very coarse thread, so then you don't get a very fine adjustment, and also it's easier to destroy that off-road.
I think it's interesting because a lot of people, when they're considering the manufacturers, they just see, oh, does it come with control arms or not? And it's
Yeah.
like, well, there's so much to the control arm itself.
Well, how often
to
are we
differentiate
mixing and
them.
matching our kits so that we're using different control arms from a different manufacturer than what the kit would have been otherwise?
Yeah.
I wish that it was still as trendy as it was about 3 years ago, but we make hybrid kits all the time for our
Nate's jumping into the comments and he's following our inappropriate behaviors. The magic bend helps the rod end find the sweet spot.
It does. Really does.
We're having cream pies today, folks. Happy Pie Day. So, anyways, all right. So we covered that. We did briefly mention track bars, and I think that's valuable. We talked about it in the last podcast. You talked about some of the old technology is not allowing the shackle lean, and where we start seeing track bars. Track bars become. That is a recommendation on a leaf spring suspension.
Yep.
It is a requirement when it comes to a control arm, either a 3 or a 4 link control
You won't
arm.
get out of your driveway without one.
So we take that is, I think,
So what does a track bar do in general?
It
The most
Locates.
generic definition.
locates the axle side to side under the vehicle.
There you go.
that's it.
Help
And-
center your axle.
And I think it was a little bit of a challenge because people didn't have an appreciation for it coming out of the leaf spring era because
Yeah.
it was
Because the
not
Leaf said
necessary,
that.
right? And then
And
it
it
became
really counteracts what the steering input is. If you unhook your track bar and you steer the Jeep, the axle will literally just swing underneath the vehicle back and forth. So every time any input you put into the steering wheel, the track bar is counteracting that to keep the axle square and allow the wheels to turn.
So there's a pro tip there. If you're trying to set up your track bar and you have the right length already,
Yep.
just turn the wheel a little bit.
Yep. Drop the bolt right in. Used to do that all the time.
And it is valuable to say that adjustable track bars were or are popular so that you can center it appropriately, not so that it's sticking 5/8 to an inch in one direction or the other. Because as you lift it, if you were to use a stock track bar, this is one of the things we saw early on with lots of cheap lift kits, is stock length. You basically are now pulling that axle towards where it is affixed to the frame. So you're shortening the distance on that the axle sits on one side, which puts your thrust angle of your suspension off in the process.
And that is one thing that is still kind of Jeep by Jeep, because this person may be a soft top with like one little duffel bag in it and don't carry anything else. And this other one might be overlanding. So those Jeeps are going to be two different heights, and therefore that track bar has to be two different lengths. So that's why an adjustable, and then you literally center it up. That's why you don't see like a fixed length track bar in the aftermarket, because that one is a little bit Jeep by Jeep, kind of make it exactly that tuning the suspension conversation to make it what it should be.
I'll give you another pro tip, if you will. We only use one brand track bar on our JLs and JTs. That's it. One brand. If you are just blindly buying a kit off the shelf with us or through us, that's your prerogative, and we'll use whatever track bar came there. But given the opportunity, we will only use JKS track bars for your JL and JT. They have the magic bend to find the sweet spot, as Nathan said.
Yes.
Yep.
So another little inside secret piece.
And it's also important. That's why brackets don't work as good as an adjustable track bar, because it's one size fits most.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not going to be, I'd say 90% of the time, centered with the bracket. You're going to be closer than without the bracket, but it's not going to be exactly where it should be.
All right. So in what situation do we have coil springs and 4 links and not need a track bar?
When you have a Chuck Norris or that kind of lift, and the upper control arms are at such a triangle angle that it is centering itself.
So if you've heard the term triangulated 4-link, which is typically how it's called, you might also hear it as a double triangulated 4-link. That's you're saying the exact same thing realistically.
It's opposite.
But you basically have
On the bottom.
opposing triangles.
Yeah.
And the lower control arms don't have to be extreme. They just need to be, sufficiently outboarded as they move rearward. And that top link, as we mentioned, with the Grand Cherokees last week, where we had that boomerang or the Iron Y up there, you basically have one affixment point at the top of the axle. Now, a double triangulated, so you have 4 control arms, you may actually have each one having kind of an independent attachment point on top of the differential, whereas the Grand had just a big knuckle.
Yeah, gives you better flex. Now, it's important to note that works in the rear of your Jeep, and it won't work in the front unless you go to axle mounted steering, which is going to be an off-road full hydro style. And if you really need to kind of look at this, the RC crawler world is a great way to look at it. If the servo that steers the truck is frame mounted, you'll see it has basically straight control arms with a track bar. If it's axle mounted, then they're going to have that triangulated style. Just doesn't work the other way.
Yeah, so you would do this because it gives you an extreme amount of range of motion out of the control arms.
Yep.
You now have this very pleasant arcing nature of articulation. It's very fluid. It gives you a lot of travel. It's an ideal setup for the suspension, whereas the 4-link has a standard arc to it, but it's not as extreme or aggressive, where it really allows the full dropout and the full suck up of the tire in that process.
Long and short of it is you will literally destroy your steering components if you have that in the front and you flex it.
And I see a lot of people. Scott used to tell his great story called a balsa wood model. General kind of, it was sitting around. It was a club meeting, and it was at like Steak and Shake, right? It was,
Yeah.
I mean, just
Sort of.
clubs just. They occupy a couple booths, and somebody's got a bright idea in their benchtop building. And when you benchtop build, the world is your playground, you know. And this gentleman brought in a balsa wood model, right?
He had literally made scale axle control arms and the track bar, and he was trying to understand the geometry of the front axle. And it's hard when you don't know the math and you don't have the computer program and that kind of stuff to try to understand how this stuff works. That's why it seems like there's magic in there, because you don't understand the engineering that is present. And he was trying to understand it, but a little misled because he didn't understand what the track bar did.
Right. And it's not to say that you can't without the math and the engineering and whatnot. You have to just kind of have the open mind to be like, okay, I'm going to learn this. And I'm going to see the travel
Lots
path.
of prototypes.
And he was building a CAD model. I mean, of sorts, right?
Yeah.
But without CAD, right?
Yes.
Is what you're saying.
Well, and the biggest challenge with that is the engineers oftentimes are designing for the optimized condition of the use. So your daily road driving, they're not necessarily thinking about, well, what happens if they flex out and they've got this one wheel on the ground, the other one way up in the air, and this back wheel's
Right.
twisted.
That's
now.
secondary to their engineering.
So their plan on their computer is mint. It's perfect.
Right.
But then you apply it in the extremes, and it no longer is
And
safe
there
for
is-
functioning.
And I'm going to take yours one, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, Scott. Don't lose your thought. I'm going to take yours one step further because I always think it's important to say the engineers oftentimes are really cool characters. And then somebody in quality control says, okay, but is it going to last 100,000 miles?
Right.
And then once after QC gets a chance to weigh in, then the bean counters, then the legal comes in and
Okay, now
says,
how do we make this cheaper?
now how do we either the bean counters say, how do we make this cheaper? And legal says, how do we insulate ourselves from risk?
Right.
Right. And so by the time that the vehicle actually comes to production, because I have had to have this conversation, I'm going to further my soapbox because I love a 3-link suspension. I love a 3-link suspension when it comes to the front specifically. And a lot of people are like, well, why would you eliminate a control arm? That's not safe. If it was safe, then the manufacturers would do it. And it's like, well, I mean, no, it is perfectly safe.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have the longevity nor the insulatory expectation that the bean counters, right? The engineer says, hey, this will work.
Yeah.
But by the time you get to the 4th and 5th level of checks and balances, they go, hey, we got to have more control arms under there to ensure that common sense or the perception of this is safe.
So real quick, because we're running out of time again, give us a 2-minute synopsis on air suspension.
Well, what
airbags.
had I interrupt Scott
Oh,
from?
yeah.
I was just going to say sometimes the real world experience will overcome something that's engineered on CAD or a drawing. So it isn't always a perfect science. You're always going to get in that specific scenario where something happened that they just couldn't engineer for.
Yep.
So
The Baker effect.
yes, it always can go awry. So don't always use that as a thing, or like, oh, that was the engineer's fault. No, he can't put every possibility in the computer. There's just too much randomness in real world stuff.
And I will say, and you heard me mention the Baker effect. You may or may not eventually become a customer that teaches us a lesson,
Yes.
to which then we assign a role or a concept
You
to you.
Become infamous.
You become infamous. Well, it doesn't exactly have to be infamy, but we had a long arm suspension set up for a customer,
Yep.
and we thought it was beautiful. We had put it through its paces, used the forklift to twist it all up. We had done plenty of road driving. And then this individual drove it in such a way, and I have no problem. I mean, I'm personally and socially acquainted to this guy, so I have no problem putting his business out there. He just would flog the ever-loving tar out of this when he was wheeling. And the Baker effect is this perfect scenario of catastrophe,
Yep.
where the suspension just had to unload and reload just right, where the drive shaft would come up and eat the exhaust.
Yep.
Because of
That classic-
again, we can't engineer for those fringe outliers.
You took it to the mechanic and it doesn't do it for them, but you can make it happen.
Yep.
Kind of those scenarios.
Yep, 100%. So synopsis on air springs, and I honestly didn't even get back to coilovers,
I know.
but and we're not going
we're
into
technically out of
we're
time on our
not
episode,
going into a third part, folks. We're just not going to do it.
I mean, the
Maybe air will come up in shocks.
the best thing that I think the quickest way to say about air is it allows you better adjustability of your suspension for height. It gives you a more pleasant ride most of the time over a coil, which is why you in the 90s saw every like Lincoln, Cadillac, all those kind of Mercedes Benz, they all had air suspension because you want to float on a cloud. Well, that's an airbag.
Yep. Yep.
And we also see it in a lot of big trucks for seats and cabs and that kind of stuff where we want to take the harshness out of it. The other advantage of that is you can also have a better load capacity with more pressure, which is why you see it now commonly in the back of semis, because you can know this diameter bag will carry this much load at this giving pressure. I have seen people use them off-road. I think the biggest hassle there is if you put a stick through it, you don't have any spring left, which is, again, why you see it more commonly on your Grands or a more street-driven, where, again, you want that pleasant ride, that adjustability. That's why the Grands have the height difference. If you're in the rock, it will go up higher. If you're going in the street, it'll go lower, as it literally can tune the suspension height, because it's just depending on how much air they put into it.
Additionally, you see it a lot in tow applications. So if you have an engineered, airlift, air ride suspension, maybe you are going to be airing up that bag. Usually those are externally mounted of the coil springs, and you're going to be airing up those bags so that you can load a heavier trailer on and keep an appropriate tongue weight and tongue angle. The downside is I oftentimes see people doing the manually inflated, insert it on the inside of your coil springs, because your springs have started to sag, or you just had a lift kit put in and you got a roof rack and a hitch carrier, or you are towing a trailer and now the Jeep is saggy and it's got saggy bottom disease. So the challenge that I put to you is that you have the wrong springs. If you have to put those little internal to the coil bags in your Jeep, then you flat out have the wrong springs for your suspension. I'm not saying you need to go with the heaviest springs. I'm not saying you got to stay with those light springs, but theoretically that's part of the tuning for how you're going to use it to the expectation of the vehicle, because all too often people put those bags that insert into the center of the springs and then they go off-roading because they want to use the Jeep in an off-road capacity, but they also want to tow their garden trailer, ATV stuff. And when you articulate, you can pinch that bag. I probably know the vast majority of customers and other acquaintances who put those lift springs in the insides of their coils and then pop them in a relative period of time, because we then use our vehicles for, articulating for extreme extension and compression, and that bag is not meant to do that.
Well, in the comments, Justin goes, you can get 18 inches of airbag. Come on. And then Daddy Jeep is talking about his bougie top pig has air ride.
Tow. It should be tow. But yes, and he's super fancy like that.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
mine too, Rob, but that's different.
That's tow reg flex.
Yes, we're doing tow rig flex. I love it. That might be a fun topic of tow rigs over the years, and how how you, our listener, get your vehicle about, and whether it is you just drive it everywhere. Do you aspire to tow? Kind of the negativities with having a tow pig, because at one time you weren't cool if you did.
Yep.
We should talk about that in the future. I hope that you guys had fun talking about this. We're not spilling over. There's so much more as far as suspension. We're going to leave air shocks to talk about with shock technology in the future. We're going to talk about tow rigs in the future, because that one just kind of came to us. That's kind of fun. I'll credit you, Rob, with that concept
With
to
the
talk
bougie
about.
tow rigs.
Yes. But hopefully you guys found this fun and entertaining, because without you, there would be no point in this podcast. So thank you so much for prioritizing your listening. And if you have any questions about setting up your suspension, we'd love to kind of help you through that process with some of our preferred manufacturers and get you hooked up with the right parts. We're happy to get those ordered and drop shipped to you wherever you live in the country or globally, really. So, if there's something that benefit, you can hit us up on our text-only number, 440-855-2100. If you do feel like kicking around hearing about our weekend and how much we enjoy each other's cream pies, you can hang out after the outro here, and we'll be happy to share. We're happy to share with you too. Until then, Jeep on.
Jeep on.
Jeep on.
You're such a 10-year-old little boy.
I am a child.
Oh, we had joked about maybe we would have the oatmeal cream pies. We would get banana cream, peanut butter cream,
Yeah, what was this? What are we eating today?
coconut cream. This is banana cream.
This is banana cream. Oh, my. Oh, you made this from scratch, Jeffrey?
Yeah. That's why it was frozen still.
It was
I used frozen bananas.
frozen bananas.
That's
Perfect.
bananas.
Oh, that's good. Pie Day is so it's so fun. First of all, I love the science behind anything, but I think it's having fun with that 314, and calling into question. I actually wore my shirt my wife got, not just myself but our whole family, and it said Inspire, and the PI is the pie symbol. And that's my official building my house shirt. And that's why I try to wear that when I go. It's like my uniform when I go work on the house, which is coming along swimmingly.
Awesome.
And I'm looking forward to, I got to play with my backhoe over the weekend. And so
That's fun.
that was very fun. But while I was diligently working on the house, so obviously all of my geriatric loved animals have all passed at this point. And so we were left with this one sort of young cat. And my wife had convinced my kids that the cat was lonely. And,
Uh-oh.
in her credit, there was a little bit of truth. He definitely had some quirky behaviors because he has never known life without other animals in the house.
Mm-hmm.
And, the writing was on the wall. They've got spring break coming up for school and whatnot. And so they had already talked about maybe getting my daughter a cat because, quite frankly, we had gotten my daughter a cat many, many moons ago, but we already had 4 animals in the household. So that was animal number 5. It was just too much. We were at a tipping point, right? Mm-hmm. So that cat had to go live with my parents. So that cat became my mom's cat, never really was my daughter's cat. So we had told my daughter, when these other ones pass, maybe we'll consider getting you an animal. Well, she made good on that, right? So my wife's like, we're just gonna go look, right? We're gonna look. She'd stop by the pound and the rescues, and
I hear almost weekly you don't go look at a cat or
No.
a kitten specifically. That's just because we first acquired our first cat. I said, let's go look at a kitten. Obviously, we took home the kitten,
sure.
and
We
I
took
get-
home 2 when we went to look for a kitten. So,
Well,
yeah,
it can't be lonely.
we had 5 other animals in the house.
Well, you know what? Long story short, we also brought home 2. Because if 1 is good, then 2 is better. Because everybody knows I love redundancy in my life. And I was not here. I did not go look. I
I didn't see that coming, but
No.
I'm so glad it did.
Now my daughter, my daughter's got more of my personality set. So she read all the profiles of these cats. She read their little synopsises. She looked at all their pictures, and she went there to look at a specific cat. And when she got there, she was all big nervous because they had an adoption clinic the day prior, and all this, that, and the third.
Will my cat be there?
Right. Will my cat be there? So they got there. The cat was there. It was love at first sight. Great. In the meantime, my wife falls in love with a cat.
Yep.
And,
Of course she does.
so she comes, I'm working at the new house, and we're dealing with the fact that the framers didn't put a single true line or wall anywhere in the house.
Darn framers.
Those darn framers.
So helpful to you.
The drywaller is not happy. You know what I mean? So, needless to say, that's
Neither was the
problematic.
I heard the electrician wasn't happy.
The electrician is also challenged in the moment, but so they come in. She's beeping the horn of the Jeep, and I'm like, oh my god, and my son had already texted me, and he was like, Rosie decided on a cat, and I was like, decided on? Like we were supposed to just be looking, He doesn't text me anymore. He ghosts me, and I'm like, oh, that's because they've got a cat. So then my wife's driving up the driveway, honking her horns. I'm like, all right, I'll go out and visit the cat. We go out there, one cat in the Jeep. Okay, cool. We did what we said we were going to do. Get through. I meet this new cat. This cat is Valley Girl Sparkles.
Oh.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Yep. And these are not kittens necessarily. They went ahead and adopted, kind of, they're not older cats, but they're, around a year old or so. They've got personalities already, but they're not quite geriatric. So Valley Girl Sparkles is in the Jeep. And I obviously have no say in the naming of these. Like, whatever. I had Camshaft and Diesel years ago, right? Like, who
Yeah,
what
it's all
I
fair.
named.
Yeah.
Yeah. So meet the cat, everything's gravy. Then my wife leans over and goes, Hubbers, I fell in love with a cat. Do you think I could get one too? And I was like, what do you do with that, right? Like, I'm like, oh, we don't really need a second cat, like a third cat, really, And I'm like, yeah, whatever. I'm honestly, I'm over it. So yeah, you're gonna do whatever you want to do. Anyways, she's like,
okay, here we go.
she's like, good, because I already put a deposit on. I was like, for them to hold them or her. So long story short, then we have Stella Luna Moonbeam. If you have any idea what's going on in my household, folks, I went from Camshaft and Diesel to Valley Girl Sparkles and Stella Luna Moonbeam.
Oh,
Oh,
my
there you
goodness.
go.
That's funny.
There's my weekend. I did backhoe things and
Very jelly
built
of
a
that.
house and we brought home more members of the family.
Busy household.
Yeah, for sure. Scott, did you even taste that cream pie?
Yeah,
Okay. Was it good?
it was.
Okay.
It was a little frozen,
It was very frozen.
but it's
It's like eating an ice cream.
So
Sort of.
almost.
oh, it's like a ice cream treat. All right, Scott. So we all saw on the social medias that
Yep.
you got a mill.
I got a mill, used mill. It is a Bridgeport clone, which means it's one of the import style that they basically took, copied pictures of Bridgeport. Was able to get it home, get it in the garage. Got brave, wired it all up myself, got it running. So that's all good. And then as also
Nice.
part of that, went out and kind of showed the harbor area of Ashtabula to one of our friends and customers.
Mm-hmm.
And he got to take some Jeep shots, which he was super excited about.
Mm-hmm.
Said that we were, needed to get some pictures of me because of our awesome latest video. So he was really excited to do that. We also were able to go to kind of a sound bath meditation as well. So that was kind of fun. And then
A what?
I'm sorry. A what?
sound bath meditation. Anyway,
Okay.
No, I want to know more.
no, because I have other updates. So then Sunday, me and my two older friends went to a
Daddy
place.
Jeep asked if it was 3-phase, by the way.
Yes, it is 3-phase. I got a phase converter to go from single to.
That's what everybody's been asking is whether it's single or three, and you got a phase converter, which is
Yeah.
a valuable conversation. I do have to take a moment, and I had a guy. Let's just own our indiscretions, right? Sometimes things are taken out of context, and I shared with an individual a perception of what Scott had said. He looked at something and he was like, yep, I know what this is. I know what that is. Oh, I see where this could be a little bit different. I know how to improve on that, and so on and so forth. And we're talking about a restoration vehicle.
Mhm.
And he says that, right? And so in conversation, I then communicate that to this other guy. And that didn't sit well with that guy, right? Because he doesn't know Scott, right? So we just kind of thought that Scott was picking him apart, right? Bringing him
Yeah.
down. And that's never our intention, right?
Yep.
I mean, I think if you were to hang out with us, like we're just kind of legitimately just going to like be silly and supportive of each other.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So then I have to do damage control and explain to the fact that like talking to Scott is like talking to a gentle grandparent who, who's like kind of just like in love with the world and, wants to do his vehicular and his particular pursuits as well as he possibly can. And when he reaches an obstacle, he then, goes, another route or reinvests in himself and his equipment to do it absolutely the best, right? So we're never kind of set by these limitations or small mindsets. So I'm trying to explain this to him. What I can't ever bottle up perfectly is the same guy who builds these, kind of awesome, V8, fuel injected, GPS, digitally controlled, kind of beautiful restorations, and bottle up that guy, and then also take that same character to a moonbeam, sound bath, hippy dippy, whatever meditation. How do you explain that to somebody?
You need to do both.
I'm fine. That's fine. All right.
So anyway,
sound bath.
So then
You were
Sunday,
bathing in sound.
it was awesome actually. But anyway, so Sunday we go to a place in Thompson, and
I want to go back to this real quick. Is this like the opposite of an isolation one?
what?
The sensory deprivation,
I guess.
or is it the
Are you
same
playing
idea?
singing bowls the whole time? Did we chant?
I did not chant.
Okay.
There may have been chanting,
Oh, okay.
and there's may have possibly been the biggest singing bowl I've ever seen,
My wife would be jealous.
and might have also been gongs with very specific things you hit the gongs.
Vibratory
I will
harmonies.
I will tell you, it was an IMAX video experience kind of thing. It was
Wow.
like the
I think there's a lot of inquiring minds out there. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So
Okay, go
anyway.
ahead, move on, because nope.
So then Sunday we went, and I was able to get a hold down kit for holding down the vise. I was able to get on the mill.
There's just no way to bottle up our sound meditation immersion, and then the hardware I need to bolt down my vise and my mill.
Yeah,
All right. I'm sorry.
I was out, also able to get a bunch of different cutters for the mill, and they also, I love going to this place. They have a drop steel bin. I promptly cleaned that thing out.
Heck yeah.
And I brought home 70 pounds of steel that I wasn't planning on buying, but
Oh, dear.
you buy it when you see it.
Right.
So that was all good. And I was able to start whittling away at some stuff on the mill actually last night. And then I realized, it was a very high of like, this was all great. And
A moment of life fulfillment.
I'm feeding, I'm just putting a little flat on it so I can use a wrench to tighten this up and make it a handle. And the mill drags down real easy. I'm like, that's not right.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a minute since I've been this intimate with a mill, but I remember that's not right.
Mm-hmm.
It should have more
And
torque
for
than
those
that.
of you who don't know, Scott is very intimate with his tools and his cars.
That's true.
Anyways, so I eat dinner. I'm processing it. I'm messaging with one of my friends. I go out and I check all the voltages. All that seems appropriate. Because of phase converter things, you have to make sure everything's even. I didn't do that before. I was too excited. So long story short, I found out on a mill, you can be wired 440 three-phase or you can be wired 220 three-phase. I am almost 100% sure it is actually wired 440 three-phase because it came out of a big industrial shop. So I now
the mill itself is
now I need to learn how to wire a drum switch and switch the motor over to 220. So that is a current Scott dilemma of how to learn how to do that. And drum switches are no joke. There is so many terminals and so many wires. So
so that one is your new challenge to
to
overcome.
learn that. And I really like now I have almost everything to do what I need to do, minus a dial indicator.
Bill McWilliams is saying he may have a few bits for you if you need anything.
That'd be awesome.
That would be very cool. Jeffrey, bring us home, man.
All right, so my weekend update was twofold. One, I went and visited with one of our customers who was offering a deal too good to.
I love the fact that I'm jumping in. We're all just like hanging out with our customers on the weekend.
We
like,
really are.
I mean, that's really true. Like you weigh in and like, hear us or watch us or whatever, and I'm like, yeah, let's all hang out. Like,
Yeah.
just be friends. All right. So, anyways, you want?
So I went and he had reached out and said, "Hey, I've got this screaming deal. If you're interested in buying a deck system for your Gladiator," and I'm like, "No, I'm not. but for that price, maybe I am.
Right.
And then I talked to Kristen about it. And I'm like, what do you think? Do we do this? Do we not? You know, we lose our truck bed space when we do this, but then we gain. We like to drive the Jeep without the doors and top on so often. We don't ever have anywhere to put all the stuff for the kids, and we travel to Erie or Cleveland a lot, so
It's nice
we've
to
got
secure.
bags, snacks, all these things, and we have no way to secure any of that for those trips. So ultimately, we decided to do it. Drove out all the way to the past the west side of Cleveland, really. Did the install with the customer, so got to work with tools with a customer. A really fun experience, just doing that. And so that's installed. That's nice. It's one of the legacy ones, so you can't even buy those anymore. It's a 2-drawer. Now they're all the 1-drawer
The
combo.
big 1-drawer with the dividers.
Yep. So I do like the 2-drawer feature on that.
Right.
The other thing was I spent a lot of time working on that saw station that I've been building, and I've got it to a point where my table saw now will sit down in it, and it's nice, flush, level. Gives me a good saw.
When are we going to see updates on your social page? When are people going to be able to see that?
You
Little
know I'm
progress.
terrible.
I know you are. I know you are. That's why I'm calling you out.
I'll try to post some pictures to Patreon. How about that?
Oh, okay. All right. I have yet to post any of my house pictures, and I thought, you know what? I think I'm far enough down the rabbit hole. I might start to reveal it a little bit to the public.
I think you should.
We might be this winter or this summer.
Yeah. So that's kind of where I was at, what I did, and it kept me busy. The weather this weekend was beautiful, despite there being a little bit of storms. I was a little bit disappointed because in the middle of the day, I got to the point where I'm like, all right, I got to saw these next couple pieces. And I grabbed the pieces, I pulled the tape measure out, and the power went off. And I just sat there. I'm like, are you kidding? All right, fine. I'm going to go get the generator. I'm going to cut these pieces. I don't care. I opened up the garage doors. There was enough daylight, whatever. No, my generator I left in the grass. The weeds grew up into the starting full cord motor. There's nobody home anymore.
Jeffrey.
So now I have another maintenance project.
Yeah, and on that note, folks, Jeep on.
Jeep on.
Jeep on.